What's a work-related accident that still haunts you to this day? Work in a dealership, and once a tech was using a tool that broke free, bashing him in the face, knocking out multiple teeth and breaking his nose. Young kid with balls of steel, apparently. While waiting for an ambulance, he was sitting there, talking, and smiled to show the damage. That smile was horrifying. He recovered and got a ton of dental work and still works there. Story 2. While building Levi Stadium, a trucker was unloading rebar when the entire pile fell on him and he passed away. I never met the man, but his cat and elderly dog ended up a local shelter. We planned to adopt the dog and ended up taking home the cat too because we didn't want to split them. Story 3. I was a cashier in a grocery store. One of my fellow cashiers was a senior, just killing time in retirement. One day, she had a dizzy spell, collapsed, and hit her head. Paramedics were called, and as they were loading her into the ambulance, she was crying out that she could still finish her shift. Story 4. A call center employee having a silent heart attack, and he passed away at his desk with his phone still active. He was basically left alone because it looked like he was simply nodding at his desk, which wasn't uncommon. He was only discovered after his phone line was randomly listened in by quality control worker, who heard the customer saying, "Hello," repeatedly with no response. Story 5. I took too big of a scoop of gravel in a mini excavator and tipped it, wasn't wearing a seatbelt, went flying out the window, shattered the glass, and fell 15 feet to the ground. Almost got crushed by the machine. Scariest experience of my life. Story 6. The time we almost killed a customer at the restaurant I worked at. He had a milk allergy that we didn't know about, so we made his food on the same grill as everything else. Apparently, his allergy was severe enough that he spent the weekend in the hospital because of anaphylaxis from cross-contamination. He was super nice about it and acknowledged that he really should have told us. He remained a regular for the 2+ years that I continued working there, and our systems changed drastically to accommodate allergies. Story 7. I used to fly small airplanes in Northwest Alaska. In the 2 years I worked there, I knew 3 pilots that died in crashes. Don't miss how those days felt. Story 8. Not me, but at the cookie factory where my brother worked, a worker passed away when someone accidentally dumped out a massive mixer full of molasses on top of him. He suffocated before they could dig him out. Story 9. Not really haunted, but we had a guy in the Army violate one of the cardinal rules of working in the motor pool. Remove watches, rings, and dog tags. He had kept his wedding ring on and was working in the turret of an Avenger, surface-to-air missile launching system. When he climbed down the tiny ladder at the back, he decided to jump down the last few feet to the ground. His ring caught on the ladder and lost a finger. He held up his hand and just looked at it and said, "Damn." We grabbed him, wrapped his hand, and took him to the hospital. Once he was taken in at the hospital, they just removed the finger. He became a cautionary tale for all my future soldiers. Story 10. Engineer decided to open a parcel with a Stanley knife. Not sure if he slipped or what angle he was cutting at, but bam! Stanley knife in him. Never saw him again, but he quickly introduced a policy that safety goggles needed to be worn when opening boxes. Story 11 was a banquet server. Getting my pocket hooked on the door and ripping my pants almost clean off as I walked out into the banquet hall full of people. Story 12. Forklift carrying a 4,500-pound steel coil. Forklift wheel went into a small pothole in concrete, jarred forward, and dropped the coil on passerby. His legs were pancakes really hits. The scream still haunts my buddy to this day. Story 13. Coworker who was fresh out of trade school was using a table saw to cut one thick sheets of plastic into strips. It was cold, so he put on some leather work gloves. A glove got caught and pulled his hand into the saw, almost left his fingers. He came to me and said, I think I hit my hand. Story 14. Used to be a wedding caterer. While the bride and groom were going to cut the cake, it started to fall off the table as they were both trying to catch this ridiculously huge thing. The bride slipped, fell into a pyramid of wine glasses on a fold-out table behind her. The table collapsed, and a wine glass hit her neck. She survived, but she was not going to be able to take that gown back to the rental place. Story 15. Not as bad as some people probably, but working at Amazon. When I started the job, a manager laughingly told me that during the summer they have ambulances parked in the parking lot just in case. I thought he was joking. I was there for around 9 months and it started getting hotter. The warehouse didn't have AC, just giant exhaust fans blowing hot air around. A girl in pre-sort directing traffic, basically sending boxes down the appropriate line, just suddenly collapsed. Full on passed out on the line. Line stopped. Girl taken to nurse. She was back on the line again an hour later. The reason it haunted me is just the fact that she came back. She passed out and still had to finish her shift. Story 16. Worked at Sonic when I was 15. I was on break and sat on the patio. I was looking at the road as this super nice car pulled into the drive-thru. As the car turned, a motorcyclist flew right into the side of him. He flew about 10 feet in the air before landing right on his leg. He slid about 8 feet before hitting the curb. His leg was really broken. I sat in shock before people started screaming to call the police. I ran inside and told my bosses. 3 of them ran out while the other workers started shutting down the store for the ambulances and police. I was the only one who saw what happened. His fingers went in all directions. But it wasn't the sight that scared me. It was the wheezing noise that he made as he slowly started gaining consciousness. He was mouthing the words, "Help me," but his lips were gone. He could only make noise. I didn't work that day and cried the whole time he was being put in the ambulance. The worst part was, the car who hit him drove off without staying a second. The owner of the car was eventually found, but nobody was charged. A few months later, the victim of the hit and run came to Sonic. He lost his leg and was still in the process of recovery. The guy came to thank us and let us know how he was doing. Glad to see he survived, but still traumatizing nonetheless. Story 17. One of my husband's childhood friends worked at a sawmill, and one day when he was working on a wood processing machine, his leg got caught in it. The guard had been taken off with no safety on it. His son worked on shift with him and had to watch his dad almost passed away. He lived, but lost his leg and spent months in the hospital. Story 18. Some genius at a tire shop I worked at deflated tires with a hunting knife sometimes. Tried it on some 80s side tires and it crapped. The knife hit his neck. He lived, but it damaged his hearing. Story 19. We were doing some maintenance on some big commercial equipment. A high-pressure hydraulic line ruptured and one guy lost his arm. I learned that day not to duck around with hydraulics willy-nilly. I also learned that hydraulic oil is toxic and the hospital needs the safety data sheet in the event of hydraulic injuries. The line had been previously damaged and not correctly maintained. Story 20. First job as an auto electrician at a car garage for Vauxhall in 2000. Walking through the workshop and one of the mechanics drops to the floor screaming as I'm maybe 20 feet or so away. His right hand smoke around it and he was trying to get his overalls off whilst yelling for help. Turns out as he was using the gas bottles, oxyacetylene, to cut off an exhaust that was giving him trouble. Some of the molten metal that dropped off fell inside the overall through the right arm and burnt straight into the underside of his forearm. I remembered the smell was like meat burning with a sweet side to it. As he's trying to get the overalls off, the material has fused to this bubbling like gooey hole on his arm. And when he tried to get them off, it must have caused him even more pain. He was writhing around, which made it very hard for us to try and help. It unfortunately got much worse though. I don't know how things went for him after this, as he never came back to work us after being in hospital for a while. Story 21. I was a dishwasher, delivery guy, food prep for a Chinese restaurant in my teens. The guy beside me was chopping vegetables and lost the tip of his finger. He wrapped it up and went to grab a glass of water. He then passed out and dropped the glass, shattering on the floor, slipped on the glass, fell and hit his body on the chopping table, and landed just beside the broken glass on the floor. Being the delivery guy, I delivered him to the hospital in my car. It was rough to see, but he was okay in the end. Story 22. I worked at a retail clothing store. A coworker was hanging a shirt on a hanger on one of those metal hooks that comes out, so that the shirt was front-facing. She couldn't quite reach, so she jumped up and her ring got caught on the metal hook and she lost her finger. I was in high school. The ambulance took her to the hospital, but they weren't able to reattach the finger. Story 23. I don't know if you can call this an accident, but I was working with this guy and he says, "I'm sick of working here. Check this out," and jammed his foot into the gears on the machine. Completely mangled his foot. Saw him 20 years later and his foot was still ducked. He was looking for a couple weeks of workers' comp, got a lifetime disability instead. It was pretty horrific. Story 24. A university student here was going through a corridor when suddenly a thing whizzed on my right side towards ground. Saw over to realize 2 students take their lives away by jumping together from top floor of building. The thing is, one of them was teaching our class as a teaching assistant the previous day. I still do not pass, though, that corridor. Story 25. I used to work at a sandwich place that made hot and cold food. There was a coworker who always came in stoned. One time, they came in too stoned, dropped the tongs into the deep fryer, and tried to pick them back up. Story 26. I was 20. Working for my aunt and uncle in an automotive shop. I was doing heavy wheels, 19.5-inch railway rims with 16-ply tires, and while lifting one, I felt something for pop in my back, followed by excruciating pain. Couldn't stand up straight. Hurt to lift anything. Told my uncle, who responded, "Get over it, and if you try to get workman's comp, we will fire you so damn fast." I didn't know what to do, and young me was afraid of losing a job that was barely letting me get by. For 6 months, I lived off of painkillers and coffee. I'm 37 now, and if I'm up and moving, the pain is easy to ignore. Once I sit down, or particularly when I lay down for bed, it becomes extremely noticeable. It sucks, but the thing I miss most, as dumb as it sounds, is just being able to run. It's extremely painful now, but I love being up and moving when I was young. Football, soccer, ultimate frisbee, or just going for runs around the small town I lived in. Those days are long gone, as is a good portion of my health. Story 27. When the concrete laborer was cleaning the concrete paving machine and the operator was in his car staying warm, and the laborer's rain gear strap got caught in the auger and dragged him in. Most blood-curdling screams I've heard as he was taking his last breath and he passed away. So sad everyone was looking for the emergency off button, but if only the operator was where he should have been. Story 28. One of best workers at my plant was forced to drive from Greenville to Charlotte after he was already on the clock for 12 hours. We told the previous shift supervisors and managers to get one of their people to take the 2 letters to Charlotte, since they forgot to send it on the truck. Our plant manager made him go, and the transportation manager kept texting him asking if he's made it yet. The last time he texted, my coworker looked down as soon as an 18-wheeler came to a complete stop. He crashed into the back, becoming trapped as the postal van caught on fire. He passed away. Story 29. Personal one here. I worked in a chemical plant and we were recycling rosin. Stuff was stored in barrels and we were opening the barrels and busting up the solid rosin into smaller pieces and then shoveling those pieces into a kettle to be melted and used for other processes. Well, we had just finished filling the kettle and things were all melted when the main operator starting the pump out process, so the kettle would be empty for another batch. Well, the process was to blow the pump line with steam to make sure it was open and then start the pump. It was a very cold day, and a steam trace line was broken near the large vessel where the rosin was to be pumped. Instead of checking the target vessel, the operator saw the steam rising and assumed the line to the target was open. So instead of following the second procedure of relieving pressure on the line, he opened the pump valve. What he did not know was that the line was closed off to the target vessel, and he just pressurized the line with 150 pounds of steam. Then when he opened the pump line, the 150 pounds of steam blew back through the pump and into the kettle we had just filled. 350+ degree hot rosin blew out of the kettle. Some of it landed on my right side and burned my right arm, shoulder, and side of my face. 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Lazy operator scarred me for life.
Story 30.
I dislocated my knee, and now every time it gets cold or it's about to rain, I get pain in my knee. Story 31. Last year I responded to a 911 call at about 1 a.m. I'm a paramedic, and my partner and I were called to an old lady's home for what we believed to be lifting assistance. You see, she was one that we had visited many times around the same time of day. She lived alone and continually had issues with mobility, but was always of sound mind and too stubborn to go to the hospital. We didn't mind this because it was an easy-peasy back to bed and cheesy, but the issue with frequent flyers is that you get too comfortable. My partner and I had a rule that if we had to think for more than 3 seconds about if we should call for the police, we just call. We did this because we were both kind of the cynical adrenaline junkie type, and we had realized that it was bound to get us into some damn danger someday. So we asked on the way for the police to accompany us. Our dispatch relayed to us that they could not understand the woman because she was so far away, but could hear her yelling. We went back and forth for a minute. Is she yelling for someone to hear her and pick her up? Or is she yelling because she's being murdered? Probably the first one, but according to our rule, we called the cops out with us anyway. When we get there, the patrol officer has just barely beaten us. He's knocked on the door, and sure enough, we can hear her yelling, but can't hear much else. I ask him if he's checked the windows, and he says not yet. Trying to be a decent guy, I say, "Hey, throw me your light and I'll walk around and check windows." I take his flashlight and start peering in. I can't see anything, but when I get to the back window, I notice what appears to be a bullet hole. I very quickly come to terms with the fact that I probably did not evaluate the situation. And before I could finish that thought, I hear a gunshot ring out behind me. I know it must have been close because there wasn't much room for a person to have been standing from that position, but also because my ears rang immediately. I was deafened, and I felt that pressure against my eardrums that you feel when you are very, very close to a gunshot. I'd love to tell you that I took in any more information than that, but I started running instinctively. I linked up with my partner. The cop made sure we got out of there, and off he ran. Not a huge fan of the law enforcement system as a whole, but I will always respect a cop who runs back in. People call us heroes, but I got out, and he went back in. Anyway, we literally dove into the front seats. I stood on the accelerator, and we got a safe distance away. I could feel myself shaking with adrenaline, and I knew I needed to make sure I hadn't actually been hit. It had only been about 30 seconds or so at this point. My partner looked me over. I felt myself up and down, and I was good. I wasn't good. This incident single-handedly unwound my life. The toll it took on my ability to do my job, the fear from constantly seeing these scenes meant when I had intrusive thoughts, they were graphic. I mean, people coming in and hurting my wife, people ambushing me at work. I became preoccupied with it. The trauma from my childhood that I never dealt with. The trauma from my career that I refused to deal with. All of it climaxed on that day and created a perfect storm. I tried different schedules. I told myself I was just going to make a slow, controlled exit and find a different job. Eventually, I had a complete breakdown and agreed to psychotherapy among other tools to cope with the post-traumatic stress disorder that I'm now able to admit that I have. It always felt so stupid to me that I don't even know if I was the target. I assume I was because I was the only thing anywhere nearby that was lit up and moving. But truthfully, I have no idea who it was or if they even wanted to kill me. That was the most debilitating part. Being so broken over something you aren't even sure happened in a way. But I eventually came to realize that it doesn't matter. It is an injury on the job all the same, even if it is a mental one. If I had actually been shot, no one would think twice about me having a limp. To what happened to me is a physiological response that could happen to anybody. And that thought still helps me every day. Story 32. When I was 13, I worked at Long John Silver's and we had the dumbest cook ever. Anyway, Paul one day drops his wedding ring in the deep fryer. To paint a picture, there's 3 deep fryers next to each other, and above those deep fryers is no less than 6 pairs of tongs. Paul looks at his hand, looks at the deep fryer, looks back and forth like 6 times, and then plunges his hand in the deep fryer to grab his ring. He manages to grab it and fling it across the room and starts freaking out about the burn. At this point, his hand was effectively nothing but one large blister, but to make things worse, he passes out from the pain and cracks his head on the sink, and we call the ambulance. We don't actually know where his wedding ring ended up. Story 33. I work with special needs individuals, and the facility I was first working at had this sweet woman whom was nonverbal, but made knows to communicate in a way. She was put on a diet of thickened liquids and puree food, which meant she was not able to eat any sort of solid foods. We had this semi-new girl that started to work over in that house who was an absolute nightmare to work with. She spent a lot of time on her phone and did not really care for the resident as she should have. One day, she made a peanut butter sandwich and left it on the counter where the resident was able to snatch it up and shoved in her mouth. She was later taken to the bathroom to use the facility and fell over on the floor from the toilet. She ended up choking on the peanut butter. She spent about 4 days in the hospital where the nurses were still digging out peanut butter out of her throat until she ended up passing away. I couldn't eat peanut butter for years after her passing. Story 34. Was near a site at Lax where a rebar guy was hit by a fallen over column that they were building. My crew was working maybe 50 yards away, and we could hear the screams of the guy's coworkers as they realized their buddy was done. It happened when pandemic had just shut the whole airport down, and the place was a ghost town, and those screams and cries were just echoing throughout the place. Story 35. Used to unload trucks. Coworker was complaining about heartburn. He was gone for 30 minutes, and I made the joke, someone go find him. I don't want to be the one to find his dead body. He was dead. Massive heart attack. Story 36. I work in a steel mill. There have been 3 fatalities in its history. A supervisor fell from an overhead crane to his death. I didn't see it, but they said he didn't scream. He didn't yell. He just fell silently to his death having stepped through an open hatch. Story 37. Worked for Edie's Ice Cream. My truck was loaded wrong, so at a stop had to shimmy between pallets to get to the back pallet. Was unloading the top pallet and the pallet below collapsed. The top pallet slid onto me. But since I was between 2 waist-high pallets, about 1,200 pounds of ice cream bent me at the waist the wrong way, sort of like bending over normally, backwards. Ended up with 2 broken vertebrae, nerve damage, and was not fun. Eventually got a 6-disc fusion and was able to walk again. But now I have arthritis in my back and it really hurts most of the time. I also have numb areas in my right thigh and my whole lower back. Would not recommend. Story 38. Worked at a factory that dealt with sprinkler systems. Watched a man using a plasma cutter on a 12-inch pipe while his tinted glasses were on top of his head. A flash from the plasma cutter melted his contact to his eyeball. In an impulsive panic, I watched him try to pull out the contact lens, and he hit his eye. Loudest I'd ever heard a grown man scream. Happened 14 years ago, and it still gets me. Story 39. 20 years ago, I was running down a hallway to stop a resident from going down the stairway in the nursing home I worked at. I was only 20 at the time, and had my entire life ahead of me. When I got to the resident, there was a huge puddle on the linoleum from a leaking ace. I slipped and landed very badly. Tried to get up and shake myself off. Got the person out of harm's way and tried to go back to work. 10 minutes later, my legs went numb and they rushed me to the ER. They thought I'd broken my neck. It was severe whiplash, a bad concussion, and a slew of other issues. Eventually, I was sent home. After I got home, I got worse and my cognitive abilities declined and my left side became markedly impaired. It was as though I'd had a stroke. That side didn't work really. The leg dragged behind me. I lived many months trapped in this new body when I'd been at the peak of fitness just prior. Finally, they diagnosed me with a mild traumatic brain injury, sometimes called a traumatic brain injury. I had to go to daily programs to relearn a lot of basic life skills and skills to compensate for the now permanently impaired skills. I resented it because I had just been a caregiver. I was supposed to be helping people, not the other way around. I went to physical therapy daily. They worked me to relearn basic body mechanics and deal the massive amount of pain. I eventually relearned to walk again and how to correctly swing my arms in order like a normal person. I had to retrain my proprioceptive system as best I could. I still struggle depth perception sometimes and spatial relations in general. Story 40. I have a scar on the top of my right foot, which was made by a co-worker stomp dancing in heels at a work party. She broke the skin, and every time I see that scar, I think of her. She bought me a giant Toblerone to say sorry, so I did get something out of it other than the scar. Story 41. Sort of unfair since I was a lifeguard and accidents were work, but I was on the beach the day this guy paralyzed himself trying to do a backflip. The whole situation was ducked. Guard on duty didn't see it happen. Two random nurses who were swimming tried to bring the guy to shore, not realizing it was a spinal injury. We had an ambulance crew on duty on the guard staff takeover, and I remember she rubbed his back and said, "Can you feel that?" And his response was, "Feel what?" Truly haunting day. Story 42. Loud, obnoxious, and troublemaker of a forklift driver who repeatedly causes accidents dropped a pallet of heavy electronics from the highest height the forks could go nearly on top of the closing manager. How she still remains employed is beyond me, since her actions would have gotten anyone fired a long time ago. She's ran into and broken several fire sprinkler systems. She's dropped pallets from varying heights before. She ran into another associate, the side opposite of the forks, thankfully. She drives fast and screams at anyone in her way, and attempts to run over people sometimes if they're walking too slow. She's damaged product before by attempting to put the forks into the pallets but misjudges the height and then skewers the boxes of products sitting on the pallets. She's damaged the loading bay doors more than once. Yet when I go to the store to do my shopping, she's still there doing the same crap. Thank God I left that place, because I can guarantee she's going to send someone to the hospital or get someone killed. Story 43. I worked at a pet food store. We were having a store meeting on a Sunday morning when we suddenly heard banging at the front door. All glass. We went up there to check what was happening, and a co-worker from a different store location was at the door with his dog, and he ran to the front corner of the store and collapsed. Another dog, the aggressor, ran in and almost went for him again, but luckily we were able to chase the dog out. My coworker and his dog just lay bleeding in a corner for a bit. They were both freaked out and there was blood. We tried getting the owner's information for the other dog, but she kept talking in circles and trying to lie or avoid answering questions. She was using a broken retractable leash for her dog and never trained her dog. And considering he had leash aggression, it was only a matter of time before he attacked another dog in person. That morning just happened to be it. Story 44. Car comes in for its first oil change. Tech straddles the bay to get a good grip, leverage on the oil filter. He slipped and caught his elbow on the hood latch. He refused to go to the hospital and stitched it himself with carpet thread. Found out later he was high as a kite and didn't want the required workers' comp substances test. Story 45. When I first started out in restaurants, a guy I worked with dropped his watch into the fryer. Without thinking, he reached in elbow deep into the hot oil. It was fast, but 350-degree grease works faster. It was gnarly. Suffice it to say, his culinary career ended that day. Story 46. I worked as a delivery driver through a blizzard that lasted all Friday into Saturday, 13-hour day Friday, and was supposed to work from open to the start of dinner Saturday. I couldn't find my boots, so I was walking through waist-deep snow in skate shoes the whole time. The dinner drivers show up Sunday. I ask to go home as my shift is over. I get asked to take one more delivery. I agree, but I tell my boss, the owner of the shop, that's gotta be the last one because I'm exhausted and my toes were wet and numb. I come back, it's busy and both drivers are out on deliveries, but two more about ready to go out. He asks me to take those. I do. It's now like 8 p.m. and I was supposed to be home by like 5. I'm taking one more delivery yet again. I'm ranting out loud to myself that this is the last one no matter what. I'll just leave even if he refuses to cash me out. Driving down Broad Street of my town, truck 2 cars ahead of me stops to make a left turn. I go to stop. I start slowing down for a second, then I start sliding. The truck stopped right in front of a patch of ice. I realize I'm not going to be able to stop, so I try to steer right and hopefully romp the curb instead. No luck. Driver's side of the front of my car slams the truck. His girlfriend gets out of the truck, starts screaming at me. "Are you drunk? Are you on substances? WWTF are you doing?" I try explaining there's an ice patch. She isn't hearing it. My mom's car is totaled. Her car was better in the snow, so I was using hers. Cops show up, talk to witnesses, realize it was just unlucky and move on, send me about my way, go back to my work, and my boss is more concerned about whether or not I'm going to keep working there than if I was all right. This all happened like 3 hours after I was supposed to be at home, warm and relaxing after working through a blizzard that was so intense we had a state of emergency declared, and it was technically illegal for us to even be open, let alone for me to be out on the road slinging pizza. No one got hurt luckily, save for some scratches on my wrist from the airbag deploying, but it sticks in my mind as I'll never allow myself to be overworked like that again. Still makes me mad like. I worked 13 hours through a blizzard in skate shoes for you yesterday. You can't just let me go home when my shift is supposed to end? Never again. Story 47. I watched a snap boomer on a chain holding down a load on a truck almost lost coworker's leg. It flung him in the air like a rag doll. I've assisted medics carrying out a dead body of a coworker. I've seen a few terrible things, really. I could do on. I couldn't imagine being a paramedic. I feel for those guys. Story 48. When I worked for a certain home improvement store, we had a timber saw on site for cutting sheet materials to order. One employee, let's call him Kevin, worked on the department that operated this piece of equipment. Now, rule one of the timber saws is that you don't put anything near the blade that you can't afford to lose. To aid in this, the sheets of wood are clamped down and secured to the cutting bed before you start the saw. Kevin, however, did not do this. He had a habit of leaning the sheets against the cutting bed and holding them in place with his hand. After seeing this a number of times and warning Kevin that he would be reported to management if it continued, I was not surprised to hear an emergency tannoy go out one day. Sure enough, Kevin had badly misjudged his distances and managed to cut through not only a sheet of medium-density fiberboard, but also hit his hand. Surgeons managed to save some of his fingers, and it took a week to strip the saw down and clean out the chunks of Kevin. Story 49. I was working on a contract in West Virginia. A guy with a pettibone was carrying something, and it was blocking his view. He struck a 34.5 kilovolt Potomac Edison transmission line, and I was facing away when he did. It looks like the sky suddenly went black from the arc from the line because he got to close. The line was still live and intermittingly arcing off the machine so they could not rescue the guy until Potomac Edison got there to de-energize the circuit. He passed away on site inside the cab of the pettibone. Story 50. I worked as a hazmat guy in a university. One of my tasks was to collect used embalming fluids from the anatomy department. They fill the body full of a preservative solution, let it steep in all the cells, then bleed it out into a container for us to collect and dispose. I don't know the full process, but end result is a slightly pinkish clear liquid with the occasional chunk of flesh in it. Fun stuff. First time I went, my boss told me to be sure to check if the cap was screwed on tight and to drive the point home. He explained that the path between the anatomy department and the hazmat storage was full of bumps, which causes the liquid to slosh back and forth. One time he forgot to check, and he hit a bump. They used embalming fluid that was dancing back and forth, turned into a big wave in the container, powerful enough to blow the unscrew lid off and splash all over my boss. I made triple sure those caps were screwed on tight. Story 51. When I was in my early 20s working for an electrical contractor specializing in server rooms, another apprentice and I were tasked with running conduit for power and data into the new server room from a set of panels like 150 feet away. He was bending the pipe, and I was standing in the suspended ceiling, on a ladder of course, hanging it on threaded rod hangers that I had already shot into the deck above. Unfortunately for me, the lighting in this area was ducking ancient 2x4s that had those Bakelite plug-in connectors. The problem with Bakelite is that it becomes very brittle with age, and after a long time it will basically disintegrate into tiny crumbs and dust if it gets whacked. As my buddy was handing me a stick of 2 inches ampere, I lost my grip, and the end of the pipe whacked into the top of one of the lights, causing the Bakelite connector to crumble, and the end of the ampere nicked the 277-volt line feeding the light. These were 20 ampere 277-volt commercial lighting circuits, and a huge fireball that came out of the top of the light, rolling over everything in the ceiling for like 8 feet in every direction, including me, of course. I immediately covered my face, knocking myself off the ladder, and fell through the ceiling almost cartoon style. It was awful. I took down a 30 section of ceiling. The lights thankfully were held up with separate wire ties to the deck, not just clipped onto the grid, so thankfully they didn't fall down on top of me. Thanks, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration inspectors who were on staff at the client. I was wearing gloves, safety glasses, and a hard hat. Otherwise, I may have gotten really ducked up. In the end, I burned off a chunk of my beard and singed my eyebrows, and I got sex up from the fall, but that could very well have been a fatal incident. Duck companies who still have Bakelite lighting connectors. Story 52. I work at a zip line at a day camp. A few years ago, one of my coworkers was finishing up at her station where she was sending kids on the zip line, and she was about to use the zip line herself. She forgot to make sure that her zip line tether was connected to her harness and jumped off the platform. She fell 30 feet to the ground. I heard her hit the ground. She broke her leg. I heard her screams of agony, even as I ran halfway across the 50-acre camp to notify the main office. Thankfully, she survived. She managed to land in the exact perfect way to minimize her injuries, on her feet so her legs were able to somewhat cushion her fall. If she had hit the ground in any other way, she would have been paralyzed or killed. She's extremely lucky to be alive and walking today, but it's still so haunting to know what could have happened. Now I'm the one who works at that station where she worked. I still feel a twinge of panic whenever someone jumps off that platform, even after I've double and triple checked everything. I still do my best to make sure an incident like that never happens again. Story 53. getting kicked in the back by a horse, breaking 5 ribs. My boss made me work for 4 hours after and only let me go to the hospital after our stable hand ran over to me because I was on the ground wheezing and crying. Then she told me to drive myself. I got kicked on the right side. I drove a manual. I didn't leave first gear. An 8 minutes drive turned into a 35 minutes ride. Story 54. In 1995, I worked at a furniture factory. We bought lumber as logs and cut and machined it to the sizes we needed to make the various pieces of solid wood furniture that we sold. Anyway, it was a small company, not very well funded. Summer came, and the owner saw a chance for cheap labor, so he hired in a bunch of high school kids. Technically, Occupational Safety and Health Administration rules would not allow anyone under 18 to operate equipment. The owner wasn't so big on Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or having machinery with the right guards, etc. One of the high school students was the quarterback of the football team. He was heavily recruited, and it was rumored that he was going to sign a letter of intent to play for a Big 12 school. Anyway, that day he was helping one of the old-timers cut parts on a big ripsaw. He goes to grab a piece of wood that is coming off the blade, and it kicked in a way that he didn't anticipate. He somehow managed to lost his hand at the wrist. Story 55 wasn't a work-related accident, but I do remember when I was like either 8 or 9, I went to a summer day camp, and it was called Liberty Lake, and basically put the camp consolers and group leaders were usually people in high school or college. Well, one day this group leader who had to have been in college at the time, he was helping the kids in his group, kids whom are essentially like elementary age, with something. And he was standing behind a wooden fence that was rotting away due to neglect. Well, he was playing catch with the kids in his group he ran. So he caught a football but slipped and landed his arm onto the fence. A nail buried itself into his arm that he was pretty much well aware of what happened and conscious. If I recall, I remember the guy saying, "Okay, that isn't good. There's a nail in my arm." So ambulance was called and he was brought to the hospital and had to have surgery performed on the back of his skull in order to remove that nail and to make sure it wasn't a rusty nail either, otherwise brain infection. Thankfully, the dude recovered well and was a group leader the following year again. Story 56. I work at a major airport as a ramp agent and I've seen some crap. 1. When I was new, an Airbus A320 was pulling into the gate. To avoid making things complicated, that just means that the engine will remain on and running even after it pulls up to the gate until external power is connected. Complacency got the better of me, and I walked right in front of the running engine. Thankfully, I was just far enough away from it to not become ground beef that day. 2. A worker was driving a pushback tractor without his seatbelt. They hit a big bump and he flew out of the seat. Our tractors don't have suspension. The momentum kept the tractor rolling and it ran them over. They passed away. Some people, even people that watched them die, still don't wear their seatbelt. I think they have a death wish. 3. Me and a coworker were chalking an Airbus A319. Before the lead gave the chocks and signal to the pilot, the brakes released early. The plane rolled backwards over my coworker's foot. He got extremely lucky, and it only rolled lengthwise down the side of his foot, barely missing it but still bruising the edge of his foot. His shoe was completely torn apart. I told him he was a lucky guy. If his foot was even a few inches to the left, he wouldn't have one anymore. 4. A coworker was not wearing a seatbelt while driving a tug. He took a corner too fast and flew out of the seat. He got a few bruises. He got a stern talking to that day. Wear your damn seatbelts. 5. We were unloading cargo from an A320 onto baggage carts. Someone went to step over the tow bars in between the carts because they didn't feel like going around them. Unlucky for them, the tug driver started driving, ran over the dude with the loaded carts. Guy was fine except for some major bruising. Don't step over the tow bars. 6. A guy was draining out the poo tank from an A319. This is done through a hose connected to a truck with a tank inside. The hose broke for some reason, literally showering the poor guy with all the crap and piss from the plane. Story 57. It's not really that bad, but it does haunt me all the time, so I'm a teacher and use those big cutting boards with the big blade arm all the time. One time I was trying to cut some task cards up really quickly before I picked them up from lunch and accidentally went down hard on my thumb. I was prepared for pain and it to be deep. But as quick as I winced, I realized I didn't feel pain and the blade almost bounced up. It had hit my fake acrylic nail and didn't go through. It barely left a scratch indent. Relief, shock, embarrassment washed over me at once. I was lucky. Not bad at all. However, it now haunts me every time I use the paper cutter and I'm very nervous. Lucky to have learned my lesson the not-so-hard way. Story 58. I was offered a job as a site lead, managing a couple of hundred people. I turned it down for personal reasons after having hired just about all the workers. I knew the guy they got to be the site lead when I turned it down, and I knew he was a lazy, stupid, slapdash, careless, thoughtless. Well, it turns out that he ran a lax safety culture, and a guy I had hired was passed away. I went back and looked at the emails he'd sent me during the hiring process. Thank you, sir, for this opportunity. This will change my family's lives forever. Yep, it sure did. I'll never forgive the guy who took the lead job, and I'll never forget the guy who died in an entirely avoidable industrial accident. Story 59. I worked at a large manufacturing company that produced excavators and was hired at the same time as a guy my age. We hit it off and became good friends. His father was the second shift supervisor, and we both worked second shift as material handlers and equipment operators. One guy on our team was a cranky old duck that would always make mistakes and violate safety policies. One day in the middle of our shift, my buddy was helping the old duck use an industrial crane to move a part that weighed 800 pounds. Somehow, the git messed up the controls and sent these 800 pounds chunk of cast steel right into my buddy. It completely broke his leg. His screams were horrific. Everyone ran to help get the part off of him and call ambulance. Everyone expects the old duck. He just got into his forklift and casually drove outside of the facility looking for the next post on his list. My buddy was in the hospital for months and was in physical therapy for over a year. Since we were contractors, the only thing he was given was a half-paid medical bill and a "sorry, that sucks, but we no longer require your services." He took his life and left behind his 3-year-old daughter. I hope you're at peace, C. I've since focused my career towards safety and try my best to use foresight and intuition to prevent accidents like this from ever occurring. Story 60. Oh man, this is my time to shine. I was working in an Asian fusion restaurant, had recently been moved up to supervisor. I was the first aide attendant on duty. I had a new cook that I had been training for the last week. He was a kind and happy guy. He was prepping our greens for the next few days in our RoboCop. Had it set up normal enough, output to the sink to be rinsed and then spun out and pat dry before storage. Now he had some veg stuck in the input on top, and instead of using the prefabricated pusher meant to be used for that purpose, he pushed his hand into it. I was out cooking at the time, and I hear a scream. I run back and see him holding his hand panting in shock. He lost his fingertip on a diagonal to the first knuckle, near his nail. Bone exposed, finger bleeding out, I run to the first aid kit. No gauze. I panic and try to find something to use. All the rags are dirty. We didn't have our shipment for the week yet. I ended up having him elevate his hand while sitting and squeeze hard with some paper towel on it. It was the best I could do at the time, as I lacked so much in the restaurant's first aid kit. I had grilled the owner about the importance a month before when I had sliced off a tip of my thumb and had to deal with it without any resources. No gauze, no aspirin, no tape, no scissors. He ended up being taken off by the paramedics and took a few days off before coming back to work. He was remarkably chill about the whole experience. I chalk it up to adrenaline. Didn't really seem to understand the severity of the situation. I ended up tossing all the greens and went home for the day. Story 61. Eric walked into a robot work area. The robot was a pallet mover, so the load, a full pallet of paper that was 80 feet above him when it broke away from the lifter due to him walking in front of the robot and just standing there. He had a wife, so he didn't Darwin himself, but as the guy setting up the robot and still being on site, everything worked as it was supposed to, and he never even knew what hit him. Just a big bang in the robot area. And nobody could find Eric for a few minutes until it was obvious the pallet area was his final spot. Story 62. 5 or 6 years ago, I watched my coworker fall 40 feet off a roof. He survived the fall, and the noises he was making will never leave my mind. He kept grabbing my arms and looking at me with his eyes wide open like he had something he needed to tell me. I don't know what he was trying to say, but I told his family he wanted me to tell them he loved them. Story 63. I was not directly involved in this, but it happened at a hospital I worked at, and I've heard similar stories from other hospitals. An elderly patient of mine was taken for magnetic resonance imaging on a metal table. Of course, when they got close, it stuck to the magnet with her caught in between. Several ribs were broken, and they had to reverse the magnet, which cost several $100,000. And it took a few hours before someone qualified, or who knew what they were doing, could come do it. This entire time, she was crushed between a metal bed and the magnetic resonance imaging magnet. Story 64. When I worked for Walmart supply chain, the receiving crew wouldn't put the pallets all the way in the rack. One had a huge piece of wood sticking out, and our forklift guy swiveled into it. He lost his arm. When I worked at Ecolab, a chemical loader didn't wear his personal protective equipment and spilled acid on his pants. Now, he's wheelchair-bound even after the skin grafts. I didn't see it personally, but one of the acid delivery guys at my company didn't wear his face shield or properly inspect his hookup lines, and he went blind. I'm only 3 years into my career, so I'm off to a good start. Story 65. I was working at Thorpe Park, and a colleague asked if I dared him to run under the magic carpet ride as it swung up in the air. I said absolutely ducking not, and that I didn't want him to do it. He decided to do it anyway. While it was in motion, he pushed through the safety gate, waited until it was at its highest, and rushed underneath. He made it to the other side as it swung down. Then as it came back up, the air current was strong enough to pull him slightly backwards towards the ride again. As the ride went up to the top, he lost his balance and fell on him bum under the ride. He scrambled like a rat out of a sinking ship and pushed so hard into the safety barrier to get away that he cracked the acrylic panel on it. The operator in the booth saw the whole thing and was laughing hysterically while I couldn't believe what had just happened. The dingus, who nearly got crushed by 2 tons of metal and plastic, had turned gray and just sat still, gasping on the other side of the ride until it finished, and I unloaded the guests. Apparently, a few of the guests in the queue complained about him. There were a lot of people waiting to go on the ride, as well as some waiting at the exit for their friends, so lots of witnesses. And he actually got fired for it. Not an accident as such, but Odin, damn, it was closer than he thought it was going to be. Story 66. I was a substitute kindergarten teacher as a part of my mandatory alternative. Didn't go to military service. A kid ran out from the queue when going out for a walk and hopped on a grass area on the sidewalk, ran some more, and then stumbled and fell. When I went to help him get up, I noticed 20 centimeters away from his head was a concrete reinforcement rod sticking out from the ground. Had he fell a little closer, you can imagine what could have happened. So a very lucky accident that I'll never forget. Story 67. One of the first courses I ever taught, scuba instructor, was to a family of 3 in a lake. On the final dive of the course, the father had a sudden cardiac arrest at about 16 m underwater. I surfaced with him and began performing rescue breaths while towing him back to shore while his wife and son began to panic. He was obese, and despite being strong for my size, I really struggled to get him out of the water and tore my latissimus dorsi in the process. His wife and son were too distraught to help. I got him out and began administering artificial respiration, while screaming for someone to call 911 and trying to console his family. He passed away well before ambulance arrived, and I've never forgotten those memories. I had to take a few months off work to recover from the physical and mental injuries. Story 68. In most bakeries, you have a dough divider. You put 20K of dough in and close the lid. Then push the cutters up, open the lid, and raise the dough, and it will be in 20 pieces. One guy put the dough in, closed the lid, and then was called away, then had a 30-minute break. Came back and forgot dough was in the machine. It wouldn't open, so he used all his strength to open it when the bolt gave way due to stress. The top part went through his chin and up to his eye socket. Story 69. I've seen a few, but the 2 most memorable were at a factory where they make rubber floor mats for cows. You have 2 people working on a lift across from each with a massive 2-ton mold between. One person operates controls while the other operates a hoist that lifts and lowers the lid. The 2 guys I were watching were on their first mat, and the man operating the hoist had just lifted a lid off of a mold that just got out of the oven. He was high as a kite on something, and instead of pulling the lid towards the rack, where it would rest as they removed the mat and filled the mold with plastic, instead sent it across the way towards his coworker. That massive and searing hot lid crashed into his partner. The partner managed to lift his arms up and was pinned between the hot metal and the controls. It melted all the skin off of his forearms. The other accident I saw at the same place was in a different department where we would trim off the excess rubber from the mats. My coworker would take his claw tool with him and sharpen the blades to make work easier. While we were talking, he wasn't paying attention and filled his finger, but running the blade right down along his index finger. He lifted his hand and let out a scream. I remember seeing his glove turn black from the tip and rapidly going down, making his glove clung to his finger. Also saw a guy drive a forklift straight into an electrical box there. Don't work at that place anymore. Story 70. I worked in a grocery store. My boss had to move a triple-stacked pallet of sugar, and her bright idea was to lift the top 2 pallets with the forklift, move them to the side, and then have me move the pallet on the floor over to where she needed it, and then stack the 2 other pallets on top. She moved them, and started moving the other pallet. I hear 2 screams, look up, and see 2 pallets of sugar coming down at me. I take off running, hit the wall, and hear the 2 pallets hit the ground. The power jack I was using was buried under 2 pallets of sugar, and something started burning the sugar because all we smelled was caramelizing sugar. Story 71. Working in a Randall's Deli, my coworker was taking the rotisserie chickens out of the giant convection oven. He popped the door but didn't move his right arm, and all the 400-degree steam instantly broiled it. I'm talking skin instantly bubbling. Also saw a guy who was cleaning a hot fryer fill the heat glove that went to his elbow up with hot oil. Working in kitchens is wild. Story 72. I work in the nuclear industry and was on a tour through a hot lab, place where they can handle spent fuel elements, in my country. The guide, who was the head of the lab, was telling us about on time when they were transferring a single spent fuel pin, inside a reactor, there are many hundreds of these, into a hot cell to be cut open. The pin arrives in a massive lead-shielded cask, and the hot cell is also heavily shielded. The dose you receive is negligible with the shielding. One of the many people there to observe and monitor the transfer decided he wanted to take a peep at a fuel pin. Standing some 20 m away from the cask, we just popped his head quickly so he could see through the small crack between the cask and the cell. His dosimeter instantly started beeping. He received a dose of 20 micros V. For reference, nuclear workers are allowed 200,000 micros per year. You might receive a few micro C per hour when walking around the containment, large building housing a nuclear reactor, during a shutdown of the reactor. 20 micro C in a second is crazy. With that, you reach the limit in 15 minutes. To be clear, he was not injured at all. Below around 100 MSV, the effects will be largely unnoticeable. And with good safety, culture radiation is easily managed. But when you don't adhere the safety culture, then the danger can be real. Story 73. I am a machine operator in a pasta factory. I make sure the machine keeps running without problems and clean it at the end of the production. I open the lid to the dough mixer to clean it, and the blades still had momentum. I got my hand pinched between two blades. It really hurt, but nothing too serious, only mild bruising in the affected spot. I was very scared, and I was cringing hard at the thought that if it was powered, I'd have been made into pasta. Taught me to wait until the blades stopped moving completely. Story 74. I was a personal trainer. There was a contest between myself, one of the guys that worked at the front desk, and a gym, regular for who could gain the most on their bench press max over a certain amount of time. I walked in one day, and the guy who worked at the front counter was lifting, and I saw him uncracking weights before he got to the amount he typically lifts. I jokingly said, "I see you're out here making sure you have to buy steak for everybody." And he replied with something about being a little tired, and I had a sarcastic retort about how good the steak was going to taste. He sighed and said, "Load it up." While pushing up the first rep, his pec muscle tore. I took him to the hospital, and as he was in his gym clothes and we went rather quickly, he had not gone back to the lockers to get his wallet. He had insurance, just not on him, and was treated very poorly by the hospital staff. It ended better as my mom actually worked at the hospital, and I got in contact with her, and we got him better treatment after he was blown off for a couple of hours. Story 75. My dad worked at a kind of factory. He was driving behind a truck full of steel pipes. One of the pipes went through the windshield and between his legs, a millimeter to the right. Story 76. Used to manage a shredding company, the ones with the mobile shredding trucks. The driver who was operating the shredder decided that the best way to clear a jam would be to jump in the shredder and jump up and down on the paper. It was very fortunate that the driver's helper was just outside the truck, bringing more paper from up in the office building, as he heard the scream from inside the truck and managed to hit the emergency stop button. The guy survived thanks to the helper, but his foot did not. It did not look pretty. Story 77. I was a volunteer firefighter throughout high school in my hometown. 17 at the time of this event, responded to a call just after starting school for the day. Left class with a friend of mine who was also volunteering. Ended up responding to a fatal vehicle collision whose victim was a girl we knew of who was only a few years older than we were. Every firefighter was heartbroken. That was a hard day. I think the hardest part for me was the conversations I had with her boyfriend and grandparents when they passed, though the scene later in the day. The life lessons learned when you see such tragedy firsthand really is incredible. Story 78. I used to have this foreman, we called him Wormy, and I hated him with every fiber in my body. He was a complete banana and would spit dip all over the floors, making rolling up the extension cords, back before we had battery tools, a really nasty job. If you were not 15 minutes early, he counted you as late, and regularly found ways to make me stay late at work. One day, while working on a compressor, he got 2 fingers caught in a pulley. Severing both of them had to be taken to the hospital. The idiot chewed my ass all the way to the hospital and then started joking I had to help him take a piss, which I did not. The next day, I figured I could be late because there was no way he would be there. But there he was, grinning ear to ear, and he wrote me up for being late. The same idiot fell down a manhole and broke his knee. I was not late the next day, and sure enough, there he was in a wheelchair, and guess whose job it was to push him around the job site for the next 6 weeks. He had a heart attack on the way to work, and he passed away, and I still don't feel guilty for being happy about it. Story 79. I was a 19-year mechanic working at a shop in a crummy neighborhood in the mid-'80s. A car pulling in for a brake exam had the pedal sink to the floor. Customer said, "Just check the brakes, any symptoms?" Belligerent mode on "No, just check them." One of the really cool Guatemalan tire installers was sitting against a workbench with his morning coffee as the car smashed into it, breaking the bench top upward and folding the man over the car's hood with the broken legs. This area was served by Los Angeles County paramedics who drove an ambulance truck. They arrived, looked at him, and probably more closely at his immigration and medical insurance status, then ended up leaving after telling a coworker to use their personal car to drive the guy to an emergency room. Never saw the guy again. Heard it really messed up his back. Hope he got proper compensation before the company folded a few years later. Story 80. Was a technician working for a company that tests military weapons. Was testing the accuracy of a vehicle-mounted grenade launcher and tracking the accuracy with hyper-cooled and heated rounds. The gunner makes sure it hasn't come out of alignment with a bore sight, which is like a periscope you put in the barrel of the launcher. He forgot to remove the bore scope from the barrel and called it clear to fire. A .433 caliber shell round detonated when it made contact with the bore scope, causing the barrel and rest of the gun to explode, sending shrapnel everywhere. Luckily, there were only minor injuries. Story 81. Worked at a trampoline place. The job was basically telling people not to double bounce each other. No one listened. Saw a lot of snapped legs. If only someone warned them. Story 82. Was a nurse at a vet hospital. One of my head nurses and a nurse in training were doing x-rays on a pit bull. The dog was super nice and very young, only about a year old. During x-rays, when a dog is under and asleep, you need to move them very carefully and in a specific way because they aren't in control of their body and can easily suffocate. Unfortunately, my head nurse, who was not smart at all, was teaching the new nurse how to turn the dog, and she just flipped the dog over from one side to another. Dog ended up dying and never waking up. I had to tell the family, a young couple who got their first dog together. It wasn't a pleasant conversation. The look on the woman's face still hurts me when I think about it. Story 83. We were being worked so long and hard we needed chemical assistance to remain awake. My coworker overdosed on a combo of Met and espresso, apparently had a heart attack. I only had way too much caffeine and collapsed. I managed to stay awake and my boss let me go home early. Other guy was picked up by an ambulance. He called us to say he'd be back tomorrow. When I arrived for my shift the next day, they told me he had passed away. It was a coffee-selling fast food chain, and we were closing shift on the Saturday night after payday. We were slammed. He was front of house and I was a dishwasher. We started around 4 p.m. and went until 3 a.m. because not only were we slammed, but day shift didn't clean as they went, so we had double the mess to clean up. My coworker collapsed right after we locked the doors at 9 p.m. I collapsed at 2 a.m. while he was at the hospital and managed to get up and work another hour. Story 84. A bomber detonated himself on a motorcycle at a checkpoint. I saw the aftermath from not too far away. Story 85. Summer teenage job and I was working in an amusement park that had more flags than you could count on one hand. In the sandwich place. About the only place that didn't fry everything. The line ran out of roast beef, and I had to clean the slicer. Could not find the chainmail gloves. Supervisor yelled at me to just skip them. I said no. He called me a wuss. Proceeded to start cleaning the slicer, and lost the tip of his finger. Wrapped his hand in a towel, told me I was right, and to please walk him to the nurse's office. Story 86. I got my first construction laborer job at 14. We were putting siding on a 3-story condo, and I was handing pieces of siding from the guy cutting on the ground up to the guy on the 3-story scaffolding that was installing it with a 16-penny nail gun. He had the trigger tied back so every time he pressed the gun to the material, the safety mechanism would fire the nail. After he called down some measurements and was waiting for the next piece of siding, he set the nail gun on his leg and broke his leg. Story 87. I was an apprentice carpenter in a granite and concrete product quarry. We had to replace the floor on a shed 60 feet up on the side of a crusher tower, where the big rocks go up a conveyor belt and get dropped down into the crushers at the bottom. Long story short, I fell through a loft-sized hatch that was just covered with a plastic sheet. Only my broad shoulders and my arms locking out stopped me falling to my death. I was literally just dangling there by my elbows, legs just hanging in midair. This was in the 1980s, before safety is what it is now. Story 88. Worked at a car dealership during the height of pollen season. Multiple times a day, we would have to drive around a pressure washer and spray off the cars to keep them looking clean. A dude was spraying one down and noticed a spot on a car wasn't coming off with the pressure washer, so he decided to spray it while rubbing the spot with his hand. Really burned his hand. I grabbed some clean shop towels and wrapped it up as fast as I could, but there was blood everywhere by the time I got to it and could get to a phone to call 911. This was pre-cell phone days. Story 89. I worked at a warehouse with bay doors. It was a windy day with wind gusts in the 70 miles per hour range. My manager asked me and another employee to sandbag the inside of the bay doors to prevent water from getting inside. I was standing to the side of the door, passing the sandbags to the other employee. Suddenly, a huge wind gust hit the door, making it bow open to the point where it was about to bust open. Suddenly, the door broke the tracks that were holding it in place and swung open with a violent force of about 70 miles per hour of force, hitting the other employee and sending him flying in the air and back 10 feet. He landed in his back and instantly went into a concussion. We heard him snoring and called paramedics immediately. To this day, I will never stand by a bay door on a windy day. Story 90. It's not haunting me anymore, but was for a long time. At around 25, I worked developmental work in a Civil War country, which has come to a fine peace now, luckily. I saw some crazy crap among this. I stood on a market with the locals to listen to a student's speech. Suddenly, military police force jumped from trucks of every side street and started shooting. I started running. I survived. That was not the only thing. Story 91. This did not happen to me, but a good friend, Rip. My friend used to drive a forklift in a warehouse, and one day it tipped over. As he attempted to jump off, it landed on him. He was being held together by the pressure of the weight. He said he wasn't in any pain, but knew nothing could be done to save him. A few of us got a phone call asking us to come see him for the last time. Only his family was allowed to stay when they lifted it off him. He was such a good guy and a good friend. Story 92. I broke my back at 20 while roofing, and my site boss came to see me in the hospital. He gushed on about how lucky I was to get workman's comp like I'd hit the jackpot. Years later, I heard that he had sawed into a live wire on a site and he lost elbow. I checked in on him to see how he was managing, and he was happy to get what he saw as early retirement. Really made me realize both how duct worker mentality can become and how ridiculously unsafe that restoration company was. Story 93. I worked at a mega church in Baton Rouge in early 2008, yes. There was this 13 or 14-year-old kid who hung around and had an affinity for sound and lighting, so this church that took in millions of dollars a year decided, let's have this untrained literal child do this instead of the paid professional we have. This was cool until the kid went up onto their homebrewed catwalk, which was loose. Unfixed 2x4s resting on supports, and at approximately 35 feet up above the ground, fell through and caught himself one-handed. The child came within the narrowest margins of dying because this multi-million-dollar organization couldn't make a proper catwalk or hire professionals. Story 94, not really an accident, but last year I had worked at an amusement park, and during one of my night shifts, a shooting had begun. I'd just turned 21, but working at a theme park, I quickly realized there were at least 100 children surrounding me, all terrified, and I needed to be the adult to calm them down and get them to safety. I quit the very next day, but now any job I work, I just get so terrified being near the entrance. Story 95. Was in a kitchen coming in for work when I noticed a couple of paramedics coming out of the cold kitchen. I went in to find out what was going on, and there was a girl sitting down in the corner with her hand in a bowl of ice water. She had been working with isomalt, which is a type of sugar alcohol to make 3-day sugar sculptures and candies, when she got sidetracked talking to someone. Her hand was in the pot stirring it, and the isomalt bubbled up over her hand. It gave her third-degree burns. It was horrific indeed. Story 96. When I was a student, about 20 or so years ago, I had a part-time job pot washing at an industrial frozen food manufacturer. One day I showed up for work, and the lines weren't running, and there was no one about. I walked towards the kitchen, where I normally worked, and just saw red liquid everywhere. One of the managers stopped me and sent me home. I can't remember the exact details, but it turns out someone had engaged one of the mixer machines accidentally, while someone was reaching in to either clean it or clear a blockage or something. He lost most of his hand. Still remember that sight to this day. Had to leave the job the week after as it freaked me out so much, even though I had nothing to do with it and wasn't involved. Story 97. The parking garage at the building I used to work in had a few grisly happenings, only one of which I actually witnessed. A guy takes his life away by jumping from the top level to the street. Sounded like a piece of plywood hitting the ground. A coworker and I went around the corner to see what was up. Wish I hadn't. The one upside of that was my coworker being much kinder after watching a man die. A few months later, a security guard was beat. To my knowledge, they never found the killer. Another guy was beat over substances deal and left for the morning shift to find. Story 98. I fell asleep behind the wheel of a 26-foot box truck while it was fully loaded, and I was on the interstate. I remember waking up just as the truck careened off the road down a steep hill on the median. Somehow managed to not flip or roll it and just ended up getting stuck in the mud. Thankfully, I was towed out. No one got hurt. And the product was okay, but I will never forget it. That feeling of panic and total loss of control sticks with me to this day. Didn't even get to go home after it happened. Spent the next 10 hours finishing my route, terrified it would happen again. Story 99. Worked at the Orange Big Box hardware store for a bit when I got out of the Army. I was helping another supervisor bring something down from overhead shelving, and he tried moving that wire netting out of the way. Well, he hit the stick on the machine, causing it to drop down a few inches. He lost his middle finger. I rendered first aid immediately, put an improvised tourniquet on him, and brought him to the manager's office. Store manager refused to call an ambulance to avoid an incident report. Had another supervisor drive him to the hospital. After massive trauma and adrenaline wearing off, the dude was about to pass out.